"You don't belong here, Evelyn. Robert's real family is sitting up front." Those were the words my sister-in-law whispered to me at my husband's funeral, less than an hour before everything changed. Less than an hour before a lawyer walked into that chapel and called my name in front of everyone who had spent years pretending I was nothing more than a guest in my own marriage. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 69 years old, and for 34 years, I was married to the love of my life, Robert Carter. If you had asked me a month earlier what I feared most, I would have told you losing him. I never imagined that losing him would be followed so quickly by losing the family I thought I had. The morning of Robert's funeral arrived gray and cold. A thin layer of rain coated the streets of Cedar Ridge, Ohio, turning the sidewalks dark and shiny beneath the overcast sky. I stood alone in my bedroom for several minutes before leaving the house. Robert's photograph rested on my dresser beside a small silver clock he'd owned since college. For a moment, I simply looked at his smile. It was the smile that had greeted me every morning for more than 3 decades. The smile that somehow made every problem seem smaller. Now the room felt impossibly quiet. I adjusted the black jacket I had carefully chosen and picked up my purse. My hands trembled slightly, but not from the weather. Grief has a way of settling into your bones. It makes even simple tasks feel heavy. The funeral service was being held at a historic church downtown. Robert had always loved the old stone building with its stained glass windows and towering bell tower. When I arrived, the parking lot was already crowded. Family members clustered together beneath umbrellas, speaking in hushed voices. Some glanced toward me before quickly looking away. Others offered polite nods that felt more like obligations than genuine sympathy. I told myself not to read too much into it. Everyone grieves differently. Everyone was hurting. At least that was what I wanted to believe. Inside the chapel, soft piano music drifted through the air. White flowers surrounded Robert's casket. Their fragrance mixed with the faint scent of old wood and candle wax. For a moment, seeing everything prepared for his farewell nearly broke me. I had to steady myself against the back of a pew. Then I noticed something strange. The front rows had small cards placed on each seat. Family seating. I walked toward them automatically. After all, I was his wife. But before I reached the first row, a familiar voice stopped me. "Those seats are reserved." I turned and saw Diane Carter, Robert's older sister. Her expression was calm, almost pleasant, but her eyes held no warmth. "I know," I said quietly. "I'm family." Diane smiled in a way that never reached her eyes. "You were Robert's wife. That's different. The family will be sitting here." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. 34 years of marriage. 34 Christmases. 34 anniversaries. 34 years of building a life together. Yet somehow, in her mind, I still wasn't family. Around us, several relatives pretended not to listen. None of them spoke up. None of them objected. I felt every eye in the room watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I could have argued. I could have demanded my place. Instead, I simply nodded. Then I walked to a seat near the back of the chapel and sat alone. Diane seemed satisfied. A few others exchanged small smiles. They thought they had won something. They thought they had successfully pushed me aside on the very day Robert was being laid to rest. What none of them knew was that Robert had spent the final weeks of his life preparing for exactly this moment. And as the service began, a black sedan quietly pulled into the church parking lot. Inside sat Daniel Brooks, Robert's attorney, carrying an envelope that would change everything. As the service continued, I sat quietly in the back row and kept my eyes on Robert's photograph beside the casket. The minister spoke warmly about his generosity, his work ethic, and the way he always helped people without expecting anything in return. Everyone nodded as though they knew him completely. Yet sitting there alone, I realized how many people in that room only knew the version of Robert that benefited them. They knew the man who loaned money and never asked when it would be repaid. They knew the man who fixed problems, settled arguments, and made everyone feel important. Few of them knew the Robert who sat beside me on our porch every evening with a cup of coffee and asked about my day. Few of them knew the man who never forgot our anniversary or who left little notes in the kitchen just to make me smile. 3 days before he passed away, we had been sitting together in that same porch swing. The late afternoon sun had painted the backyard in shades of gold. Robert looked tired, far more tired than he wanted to admit, but there was a calmness about him that I could not explain. He had been watching the birds near the maple tree when he suddenly reached for my hand. "Promise me something, Evelyn," he said. I laughed softly, and told him he sounded serious. "I am serious," he replied. His grip tightened slightly. "No matter what happens, stay until the very end." At the time, I assumed he was talking about his illness. The doctors had been honest about his condition. We both knew our time together was limited. I told him I would never leave his side. He smiled, but there was something else behind that smile. Something thoughtful. Something almost concerned. "Not just with me," he said quietly. "With everything. Stay until the very end." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he changed the subject. Looking back, I realized that conversation had not been about saying goodbye. It had been a warning. Back in the chapel, I noticed several members of Robert's family gathered near the front. Diane leaned toward her younger brother Michael and whispered something that made him smirk. A few seats away, Robert's nephew Kyle checked his phone repeatedly, barely paying attention to the service. Their grief seemed shallow, distracted. More than once, I caught them glancing toward me before quickly looking away. It was as if they were waiting for something. Or perhaps waiting for someone. Then I remembered another strange moment from the previous month. I had walked into Robert's home office and found him organizing documents into several large envelopes. When I asked what he was doing, he simply smiled and said he was putting things in order. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Robert had always been organized. Now, sitting alone in the back of that chapel, the memory returned with unusual clarity. The envelopes. The serious expression. The promise he asked me to make. And somewhere outside, just beyond those church doors, Daniel Brooks was arriving with answers I did not yet understand. The service finally ended just after noon. People began standing, gathering coats and umbrellas, speaking in low voices as they slowly moved toward the church hall where refreshments had been arranged. I remained seated for a moment, staring at the arrangement of white lilies beside Robert's photograph. The room that had felt crowded only minutes earlier suddenly seemed much larger. Empty spaces appeared between groups of relatives, but the distance I felt from them remained the same. When I finally stood, I noticed Diane and Michael near the front entrance. They were speaking with Kyle and 2 other cousins. Their conversation stopped the moment they saw me approaching. I lowered my eyes and continued walking, pretending not to notice. Years ago, I would have convinced myself that I was imagining things. Robert always tried to see the best in people, and over time I had learned to do the same. But grief has a strange way of removing illusions. It leaves only what is real. As I entered the church hall, I accepted a cup of coffee from a volunteer and found a quiet corner near one of the windows. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Outside, the parking lot shimmered beneath the gray sky. Inside, conversations drifted through the room in fragments. Memories of Robert. Discussions about travel plans. Casual remarks that felt strangely disconnected from the purpose of the day. Then I heard Diane's voice. She was standing less than 20 feet away. "The estate should be straightforward," she said quietly, though not quietly enough. "Robert never liked dealing with financial details. Thank goodness everything is finally being settled." Michael nodded. "It is about time. The family has waited long enough." I stared into my coffee cup. Something about those words unsettled me. Not because they were discussing the estate. That was inevitable. What disturbed me was the certainty in their voices. The confidence. As though important decisions had already been made. As though outcomes had already been guaranteed. A few minutes later, another memory surfaced. About 6 weeks earlier, I had entered Robert's study without knocking. He had quickly closed the folder when he saw me. That alone was unusual. Robert never hid things from me. Before I could apologize, he smiled and said, "Just taking care of a few details." I remembered noticing Daniel Brooks's business card on the desk beside him. When I asked if something was wrong, Robert shook his head. "Everything is exactly as it should be." At the time, I accepted the answer. Now I wondered whether he had already begun preparing for something he knew was coming. A sudden hush spread through the room. Conversations faded. Heads turned toward the entrance. I followed their gaze and saw Daniel Brooks walking through the doorway carrying a slim leather portfolio beneath his arm. He moved calmly through the crowd, greeting a few people with polite nods. Then his eyes found mine across the room. For a brief moment, his expression softened. Not with sympathy alone, but with recognition. As though he knew something no one else knew. And as he continued walking toward me, I realized Robert's final promise had not been about enduring grief. It had been about surviving what came after. Daniel stopped a few feet from me and extended his hand. "Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice was calm, professional, and somehow reassuring. "I was hoping to speak with you before everyone left." Several conversations around the room immediately quieted. I noticed Diane watching us from across the hall. Michael folded his arms. Kyle slipped his phone into his pocket and stared openly. Daniel glanced around the room before lowering his voice. "Robert asked me to make sure you stayed after the service." A chill moved through me. Not because of fear, but because those words sounded almost identical to what Robert had told me on the porch 3 days before he passed away. Stay until the very end. For the first time, I began to understand that those words had never been accidental. "What is this about?" I asked. Daniel offered a small smile. "I think it would be better if everyone heard it together." Before I could respond, Diane approached us. "Daniel," she said pleasantly, "we were actually discussing when the family should meet regarding Robert's estate." The emphasis she placed on the word family was impossible to miss. Daniel remained polite. "That question will be answered shortly." Diane's smile tightened. "Wonderful." Then she walked away. I watched her join Michael and Kyle near one of the tables. The three of them immediately began whispering among themselves. The longer I observed them, the more memories resurfaced. Little moments I had ignored for years. 2 summers earlier, Robert had loaned Michael $20,000 to help save a struggling business. Michael promised to repay him within 6 months. He never did. Diane frequently called whenever she needed financial help with home repairs or unexpected expenses. Kyle had spent years drifting between jobs, relying on Robert whenever he found himself in trouble. Robert rarely complained. He loved his family. But during the final year of his illness, I noticed subtle changes. He stopped discussing money with them. He became more private. More observant. Once, after a particularly uncomfortable family dinner, he sat quietly in the kitchen long after everyone had left. When I asked what was wrong, he simply stared out the window and said, "Sometimes people reveal who they are when they think time is running out." At the time, I assumed he was talking about himself. Now I wondered if he had been talking about them. Nearly 30 minutes passed before Daniel finally stepped into the center of the room. He cleared his throat gently. The remaining guests turned toward him. Some looked curious. Others looked impatient. Diane immediately moved closer. Michael followed. The atmosphere shifted. Even the soft background conversations disappeared. Daniel opened his leather portfolio and removed a large sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Robert's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words that made my heart stop. To be opened after my funeral. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Diane frowned. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Kyle. Daniel carefully held up the envelope for everyone to see. Then he looked directly at me before addressing the room. "Robert Carter left specific instructions regarding this letter. He also left instructions regarding who must be present before it is opened." The room became completely silent. Then Daniel spoke the next sentence. And according to Robert's written instructions, we cannot begin until Evelyn Carter is seated at the head table. For several seconds, nobody moved. I was not sure whether I had heard Daniel correctly. The head table had been reserved for Robert's immediate family. Earlier that morning, Diane had practically announced that I was not welcome there. Yet now, according to Robert's own instructions, the very seat they had denied me belonged to me. Daniel waited patiently. "Mrs. Carter," he said, gesturing toward the table. "Please." Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me. I felt my face grow warm, but I kept my expression calm. Robert had always admired quiet dignity. I could almost hear his voice reminding me not to rush, not to react emotionally, not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me uncomfortable. So I simply nodded and walked across the room. The silence followed me with every step. Diane stepped aside without saying a word. Michael suddenly seemed fascinated by the floor. Kyle avoided eye contact completely. A few guests exchanged confused glances. They had witnessed what happened in the chapel. They knew exactly how I had been treated only an hour earlier. When I reached the head table, Daniel pulled out a chair for me. It was positioned directly in the center, the place where Robert would have sat. My hands rested lightly on the table as I settled into the seat. For a moment, emotion threatened to overwhelm me. Not because of the attention, but because Robert was not there beside me. He should have been smiling across the table. He should have been making one of his terrible jokes to ease the tension. Instead, all that remained was his absence and whatever message he had left behind. Daniel remained standing. "Thank you," he said. Then he carefully opened the envelope. The sound of the seal breaking seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. He removed several pages and adjusted his glasses. "Before I begin," he said, "I want everyone to understand that these instructions were written personally by Robert Carter and reviewed with me on multiple occasions. He was very clear about his wishes." Diane shifted in her chair. "Can we just get to the estate details?" she asked. Daniel looked at her briefly. "The estate details will come later. Robert specifically instructed me to read this letter first." Her expression tightened, but she said nothing more. Daniel unfolded the first page. "To my family," he began. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone, and Evelyn is sitting exactly where she belongs." A murmur moved through the room. Daniel continued reading. "For many years, I watched people claim they loved me. Some truly did. Others loved what I could do for them. The difference became very clear during my illness." The room grew still again. Michael's shoulders stiffened. Diane folded her hands tightly together. Daniel lowered his eyes to the next paragraph. "I know some of you believe my passing marks the beginning of your reward. If that is what you are thinking, then you understand neither my values nor my intentions." Suddenly, the confidence that had filled the room earlier began to disappear. And for the first time that day, I saw uncertainty spreading across faces that had seemed so certain of victory only hours before. Daniel continued reading while the room remained completely silent. "During the final year of my life, I learned more about the people around me than I had learned in the previous 20 years. Illness has a way of revealing character. Some people step closer. Others begin measuring what they think they will inherit." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even Diane seemed unwilling to challenge Robert's words now that they were being read aloud for everyone to hear. Daniel turned the page. I watched carefully. I listened carefully. Most importantly, I paid attention to how people treated Evelyn when they believed I was not paying attention. My heart skipped. Across the table, Diane lowered her eyes. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Daniel continued. The greatest mistake some of you made was assuming that my love for my family made me blind. It did not. I saw the conversations that stopped when Evelyn entered a room. I noticed the invitations that somehow never reached her. I noticed who thanked her for caring for me and who treated her like an obstacle standing between them and something they wanted. A heavy stillness settled over the room. Suddenly I remembered dozens of small moments I had dismissed over the years. Holidays where I felt tolerated rather than welcomed. Family gatherings where conversations seemed to pause whenever I joined them. Birthdays where Robert was included in plans but I was treated as an afterthought. At the time, I ignored those things because Robert loved his family. I never wanted to create conflict. But hearing his words now, I realized he had seen everything. Daniel paused briefly before reading the next paragraph. There is something else everyone should know. 6 months before my passing, I asked Daniel Brooks to conduct a complete review of every loan, gift, and financial arrangement I made over the years. Several heads immediately lifted. Michael looked alarmed. Kyle's face lost color. The results were enlightening. Daniel read. Some debts were never repaid. Some promises were never honored. Some expressions of gratitude vanished the moment another check was requested. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Robert's words were not angry. That was what made them so powerful. They were calm. Precise. Certain. Daniel reached the final paragraph on the page. If you are feeling uncomfortable right now, ask yourself why. Honest people rarely fear the truth. And before anyone begins discussing my estate, there is one fact that must be understood clearly. Everything that follows was designed with one purpose in mind, protecting the person who stood beside me every single day. Daniel lowered the page and looked directly at me. For a moment, emotion tightened my throat. Not because of money. Not because of inheritance. But because even after he was gone, Robert was still defending me. Then Daniel placed the first pages aside and reached for a second sealed document inside the portfolio. The expression on his face changed slightly. More serious. More deliberate. The letter is only the beginning, he said quietly. What comes next contains Robert's final instructions regarding the estate. The second document was thicker than the first. Daniel carefully unfolded the pages and glanced around the room before speaking. These instructions were finalized 4 months before Robert's passing and have not been altered in any way. I noticed several relatives leaning forward in their seats. The anticipation that had filled the room earlier was still there, but now it was mixed with anxiety. The confidence they carried into the church that morning had begun to disappear. Daniel cleared his throat and started reading. To everyone gathered here, I know many of you assume you already understand how my estate has been arranged. Some of you have likely spent months discussing possibilities. Others may have made plans based on expectations that were never promised. If so, I encourage you to listen carefully. A faint tension spread through the room. Michael crossed his arms. Diane stared straight ahead. Kyle sat unusually still. The first decision I made was simple. Daniel continued reading. The house on Willow Creek Road, including all surrounding property and contents, belongs entirely to Evelyn Carter. A collective silence followed. Even though I knew Robert loved our home, I had never expected him to make such a direct statement. The house was where we had built our life together. 34 years of memories filled every room. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt overwhelmed. Daniel continued before anyone could react. The second decision concerns all investment accounts, retirement funds, and financial assets accumulated during our marriage. Michael suddenly leaned forward. Diane's eyes narrowed. Daniel read the next sentence without hesitation. Control of all major assets transfers directly to Evelyn Carter. A sharp breath escaped somewhere across the room. Nobody spoke, but the atmosphere changed instantly. The assumptions people had carried with them were collapsing one by one. Then Daniel reached the section that truly mattered. His voice remained calm and steady. Some family members may wonder why I chose this arrangement. The answer is simple. Loyalty deserves protection. Sacrifice deserves recognition. And no one sacrificed more for me than Evelyn. My eyes filled with tears, but I blinked them away. Robert never liked public displays of emotion. He always believed actions carried more weight than words. Daniel continued reading. However, there is one additional provision. Over the past year, I observed how people treated Evelyn when they believed my influence was fading. Those observations affected every decision that follows. Several faces around the room tightened. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Specific gifts and distributions were prepared for various relatives, Daniel read. But each of those distributions was made subject to a simple condition: that Evelyn be treated with respect, dignity, and inclusion both before and after my passing. The room became completely still. Michael's expression changed first. Then Diane's. Then Kyle's. They were finally beginning to understand. Robert had not simply written a will. He had created a test. And based on everything that had happened that morning, I had a feeling many people in that room had already failed it. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The weight of Robert's words seemed to settle over the room like a heavy curtain. Daniel placed the document on the table and looked around carefully before continuing. "There is an addendum," he said. Robert anticipated that there might be questions regarding how this condition would be evaluated. Michael finally broke the silence. "Evaluated by whom?" His voice sounded far less confident than it had earlier that day. Daniel did not hesitate. "By me." The room grew still again. Over the last several months, Robert asked me to document specific concerns he shared regarding family interactions. He also instructed me to observe certain events after his passing. Diane sat upright. "You are saying this was some kind of test?" Daniel folded his hands. "No. I am saying Robert wanted confirmation that the people receiving his generosity were capable of extending basic kindness to the person he loved most." I lowered my eyes to the table. Even now, hearing those words affected me more deeply than any discussion of money ever could. Daniel opened another page. Robert specifically stated that any individual who attempted to exclude, humiliate, pressure, or marginalize Evelyn Carter following his death would immediately forfeit all distributions designated to them. A shocked silence swept through the room. Several guests exchanged stunned glances. Then Daniel continued. "This provision was not symbolic. It is legally binding." Michael leaned back heavily in his chair. Diane stared at the papers as though willing them to change. Kyle looked completely lost. Daniel calmly reviewed several examples Robert had personally listed. Exclusion from family events. Deliberate disrespect. Attempts to challenge Evelyn's place within the family. Public efforts to diminish her standing as Robert's wife. With every sentence, the atmosphere became more uncomfortable. Then Daniel reached the final note. "Robert instructed me to pay particular attention to the events surrounding his funeral service." My heart began to beat faster. Across the room, Diane's face slowly lost color. Daniel looked down at his notes. "This morning, multiple witnesses observed Evelyn being denied a seat among immediate family members." Nobody said a word. Several witnesses also reported statements suggesting that Evelyn did not belong with the family despite being Robert's wife of 34 years. The room felt frozen. Diane opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Daniel closed the folder. "Based on Robert's written instructions and the documented events that occurred today, certain distributions have already been revoked." A stunned silence followed. Not anger. Not outrage. Just disbelief. The outcome they had assumed was guaranteed had vanished before their eyes. Yet what surprised me most was my own reaction. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel satisfied. I simply felt seen. For years I had quietly endured small dismissals and subtle insults because I loved Robert and wanted peace. Now, sitting at the head table, I realized something extraordinary. Robert had seen every one of those moments. He had understood far more than I ever knew. And even after he was gone, he had found a way to make sure the truth could no longer be ignored. The meeting ended differently than anyone had expected. When people arrived that morning, they believed they were attending a funeral. By late afternoon, many of them had been forced to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. One by one, guests began leaving the church hall. Some offered quiet condolences. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The conversations that filled the room earlier had disappeared. In their place remained a heavy silence, and the uncomfortable realization that Robert had understood far more than anyone imagined. Diane approached me just before she left. For a moment, she looked older than I had ever seen her. The confidence that once defined her expression was gone. "Evelyn," she said quietly. I looked up from the table. She seemed to search for the right words. I did not realize Robert felt that way. I considered her statement carefully. Then I answered honestly. "I think Robert felt exactly the way he wrote." She lowered her eyes and nodded. There was nothing else to say. A few minutes later, Michael left without speaking. Kyle followed soon after. Neither of them looked angry. They looked disappointed in a way that had nothing to do with money. Perhaps for the first time, they understood that Robert had measured them by something other than family ties. Daniel remained behind after everyone else had gone. Together we walked back into the now empty chapel. The flowers still surrounded Robert's casket. The stained glass windows glowed softly as afternoon light filtered through the clouds. The building felt peaceful again. Quiet. Honest. Daniel handed me a small envelope. "There is one final note," he said. "Robert asked me to give this to you privately." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The message was short. Just a few lines written in Robert's familiar handwriting. "My Evelyn, if you are reading this, then you stayed until the very end. I knew you would. There will be people who suddenly remember your value now that they understand my decisions. Be kind, but do not forget who stood beside you and who walked away. Most importantly, never question where you belong. You were my family from the day I met you. You were my home for 34 years. And if anyone ever makes you feel unwanted, remind them whose name I trusted most." I read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it inside my purse. Tears filled my eyes, but this time they were different. The grief remained. I would miss Robert for the rest of my life. Nothing could change that. But the uncertainty that had haunted me since his passing was gone. For years I had wondered whether I truly belonged within his family. That question no longer existed. Robert had answered it himself. As I stepped outside the church, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected across the wet pavement. For the first time since losing him, I felt something unexpected. Not happiness. Not relief. Something quieter. Peace. Robert was gone, but his final act was not about inheritance or punishment. It was about truth. And thanks to him, everyone finally knew exactly where I belong.